Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you, Una. From those pictures, I think I'd rather stick to my marathon running than try to be a tough mudder, actually. It looks far too difficult. As the previous speakers have said, this is fundamentally a cooperative piece of work that we've been doing for about 6 months now, since February, meeting fortnightly. And there's been a tremendous amount of effort put in by key individuals in that process, and I also would like to thank them for their commitment and time that they've given to this. So Una and Nigel have very much set the scene for you. You know, we know we have an issue. We know we have aging infrastructure. We now have an assessment of what we think that prize is. Hannah Westwood and others have done a lot of work there to try and identify that. It is potential. It requires some investment to realize it clearly. Exploration and appraisal are critical. We can't deny that. But our perspective is to look at ensuring that there is the infrastructure there for the future. So what is the future potentially? So if as a team, we sat down, we thought, okay, we want to know something that's going to match what we see theoretically as the volumes that are in this basin. And I guess fairly rapidly, the team concluded, well, let's have a look around and see what others have been doing. We're not alone in this industry. We know of many basins which are as equally mature, which may have similar problems, may have slightly different problems, but I think it would pay us dividends to actually go out and ask them and try and look fundamentally at what they've been doing. Have they been tackling the same problems? Have we got future problems or problems that they've come across that we may run into in the future? And then another key area is that having seen the work that Una's been doing with Hannah Westwood, can we then build potentially on that potential prize to do two things with it? One, to actually make it bigger, and that's about the task of reassuring that there is fundamental asset integrity and that there is good reason potentially to keep infrastructure alive under certain models that will assure its presence for the future. Now, we're not dreaming here. We're not sort of thinking about mothballing on the opportunity that we might find another 100 million barrel field. But there must be ways that we can actually try and extend that life longer than simply saying, well, I'm the prime owner of this field has justified production, I've finished, right, I'm off. Come in decommissioning. That cannot be a model for this basin. And if we then say there is a potential prize, how are we going to realize it? How are we actually going to do things slightly differently? And what could the things that we do differently look like? So we sat down fairly early on and said, okay, we want to try and sort of define a future. So what you see here, and it's quite detailed, is a list of the areas that we felt as a team, both from the owner's perspective and what we call the third-party perspective. Now, as we know in the basin, there's a mix of equity in host, equity in third-party, etc., but a fairly complex historical picture. But can we fundamentally give ourselves a list of key items, a specification, if you like? The engineers amongst us like that concept of can we specify what our future would look like? And we came up with this list of items. And I'll fairly quickly run through them. I'm sure you can read them. But just to give a little bit of background to the thinking behind them. Early and transparent knowledge of the service, predictability. This is key, and you'll hear this theme recur quite a lot this morning. Nigel has already touched upon it as a result of the survey. Undoubtedly, transparency of information within the industry is critical to making decisions which are in the best interest of the industry and also done quickly. Timing, as we've heard all along, is actually critical. Equitable distribution of risk and reward. Now, most of us sit there and say, well, that's very easy to say. Of course it is. And I think one of the challenges we've always had is each person's definition of those two items are quite different. But again, through information, you should be able to understand better what the counterparty's risk and reward is. So again, sharing. Fair return on owner investment. Again, if someone's taking a risk in terms of taking additional volumes, we've seen under the survey with Nigel that there's issues on contamination, there's issues on load-bearing capacity, there's issues on doing the business. How do you measure that? How do you measure that as a commitment on the part of the owner? Robust conclusion to negotiations. Yes, we'd love to do that. And that means not only actually concluding a negotiation, but even deciding right up front that there is no negotiation, that this is not going to work. Let's just decide we'll go elsewhere and we'll look at another hub, I'll look at another option. Business models that encourage effective competition. This has been round and round the team quite a lot because competition is effectively in two forms. It can be real competition through multiple host access, as Una has identified, or it can be a regulated style competition, where if there is a monopolistic position, the regulator, i.e. DEC or the government, can influence that decision. Infrastructure proactively marketed. Yeah, traditionally the infrastructure originated on the basis of the prime field, the prime discovery. It was never established to effectively go out and seek what may be within the catchment area of that host. Should we then say, okay, you should be encouraged to actually go out and look into that basin? You may not have equity in there, but surely in your overall interest, there must be mileage in exploring your catchment. Incentives to invest and maintain the infrastructure. And again, I think we're all aware that this is the nature of the current basin that we have, infrastructure which is there, which needs to, if we have any chance, needs to maintain its integrity and safety. And then again, a context that enables strategic planning. And again, this is looking slightly longer term. So this list, if you like, sort of works in time from things we think we can do pretty quickly to an ambition at the bottom in terms of looking in a broader context. So just a few words then on, we kicked off a study to have a look at what others do. And really, it was quite a complex piece of work, quite a lengthy report. But there were three real themes that recurred from other experiences. And I've summarized them here as transparency, regulation, and standardization. Now, I've already touched upon the transparency issue. We see that a lot in, for example, USA, Gulf of Mexico, Canada, Norway. It comes in slightly different forms, but the theme is that there is information in the marketplace before a negotiation commences, before a party decides that it believes it wants to go through a particular host. It has information historically, even to the extent that it can test tariffs. So hence the second point, a reference tariff, which is published. It doesn't say that has to be the tariff. In Canada, they go into a range of tariffs, but equally they face the struggle of actually getting them a specific tariff. Regulation, again, we see regulation in a number of areas, but it depends. In some areas it's heavy-handed, in other areas it's a light-handed regulation. But significantly it acts as a backstop in quite a number of areas. So it's there, but it may not be used. Standardization, again in Norway, they're looking heavily at effectively standardizing TPAs and various documents. Number of areas, though, there is a significant state equity balancing position. In Holland, we have EBN, Denmark, you have Dong, and of course in Norway, you have their influence in Gassco and Gasled. And we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that balancing effect in those countries. We don't wish to promote bringing BNOC back, so Robert, you can rest easy. But fundamentally, clearly, we need to be thinking along how we can balance. But none of them are perfect. So just a final slide then. So from that, what are we working on and what are we looking at in a little bit more detail? And unsurprisingly, the stewardship regulation one is top of the list. We have ICOP. ICOP is working. Our current view is it could work better. And Keith has been doing work in his work group to effectively bring it up to date and to improve it. We think it can go further. Transparency is a key issue. We can go as far as looking reference tariffs. Here in our group, we've talked about what I call the hotel scenario. This is the concept of, imagine you have to go and do some business in London and you want to deal with a particular supplier. So you go on to Google and you look where they are and you want to find yourself a hotel in that area. You can then decide whether I want a first 1-star, 5-star, pay the price, etc. for that particular access or that particular hotel in terms of the service I wish. It's a crude model, but it gives you the idea that if I have information, I go online and I can effectively book in. I know what that service is, I know what the price is, I know what I'm going to get. Now that's very simplistic. As a colleague yesterday commented, how do you assure the load-bearing capacity of a bed in a 1-star hotel? Stewardship process also recurs, and this is again back to the comments about collective thinking. We need to work in a more holistic concept in terms of looking at hub potential. It's not sufficient just to look at that hub and say, well, there's potentially business here. We need to aggregate potential developments. We need to aggregate even prospects. We need to think, is there E&A potential around a particular hub that needs to be encouraged to provide the volumes to sustain the hub? That needs to happen. That needs to happen. Commercially, yeah, we need to look at this same concept of aggregation in terms of new developments which aren't bespoke to a particular field, but look again in aggregation across an area which has potential. Now that's quite difficult because, as we know, discoveries come from E&A. E&A pace is very much dictated by individual field and license investors. But again, we need to think somehow to influence that on an aggregated basis. And one area that we've looked at quite interestingly is this idea of unbundling. Is there a scenario where you simply say, well, let's take the whole of the infrastructure aspect away from the fields, from the reserves, from the wells, and let's establish business models, tax models, whatever, that effectively give an incentive for an owner to run that piece of infrastructure on a different footing. Now, that's quite an interesting one. It's quite a difficult one, again, because of the history of the origin of that infrastructure, about the risks associated with it. It touches on the decom issues. How do you transfer the decom liabilities? So there's quite a lot of issues in there, but it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that's worth exploring. Fiscal, at the very bottom. Supplemental charge, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but clearly we have an increase in the charge, and it's been established on tariffing incomes. If you reduce that, you potentially reduce the burden, the fiscal burden, on the third party. And we could even go as far, if we do have scenarios of aggregated developments, why not then think about fiscally encouraging that? So it's just an extra push to help us look collectively at hub scenarios, particularly the critical hubs in northern central North Sea. So that's really all I was going to say, and I'd like to hand back to Jonathan to conclude this morning's presentations.